Hi guys, Goffy here and welcome to another video. If you've been following me along over on Instagram, you'll know that I've been lusting pretty hard over a Leica M11. And in today's video, the guys over at Leica Mayfair let me loose with the camera for a day. So I want to try and answer two different questions. Question one, is the new M11 a worthy successor to the Leica M10? And the second question is, am I going to upgrade? I currently own my M10, am I going to upgrade to the M11? So in today's video, that's the two questions we're going to try and answer. And if you want to hop around this video and you're feeling a bit impatient, here's some timestamps up on the screen. In terms of the demo unit that I was actually allocated, I was given the silver model. Now, my current M10 is the black model, and the thing that I wasn't expecting was the fact that these two cameras basically weigh the same, and that the new black M11 offers a pretty substantial weight saving over my current M10. Now, I never actually held the black model because I was allocated the silver one. I do worry a little bit if that weight saving makes the black version feel maybe a little bit cheaper and maybe not as sturdy as my current M10, but it definitely makes me appreciate the fact that I can now opt for the silver model, which would match my M6, and not have to worry about carrying all that extra weight. One of the other really obvious design changes is on the bottom, and that's the fact that we now have no base plate and that there's a little switch there that you can pop the battery out. It doesn't actually fall out until you poke the battery again, and then it drops out nicely. This makes changing the battery really quick. That's also where you'll find the SD card, and the other thing on here as well is a USB-C connection that we're going to talk about in a little bit. The other design change that stood out to me was the three buttons on the back. They've moved to the left a little bit and are no longer part of the screen module like they are on the M10, which likely makes pressing them a little bit easier, especially if you're wearing gloves. And the other thing is they've swapped two of the buttons around. So I think the live view and the menu button have flipped around. Not really sure why, but it was pretty easy to get used to. Next up then was switching on the camera. Now, before I'd actually taken this camera out, I'd read online a lot of people complaining about the fact that the M11, its boot up time is not very quick. I did some kind of races with my M10 and I found that the M10 was consistently, in terms of my video recording, 4 frames a second quicker at booting up, which in real life terms equates to about 1/6 of a second. Did I notice that the M11 was slower than the M10 at booting up? I didn't in real use. Maybe you would, but I never noticed it myself. Then, having turned the camera on and turning it over, I was super impressed at how responsive the touchscreen is on the back of the M11. My experience with touchscreens on cameras are normally just switch it off because they're a little bit terrible, but this main menu on the back of the M11 just feels right. It feels very much like an iPhone or a mobile phone where it just feels super responsive and very tactile. And then when it comes to firing the shutter, the M11 is far quieter than my M10. The other kind of main design change for me is the fact that the camera now comes with 64 gigs of internal memory, which means this is the first M camera where you can run arguably 2 cards in backup, but one of them is internal. So if your memory card fails, you've always got it backed up. The other really good thing about this is you don't even need an SD card. I'm somebody that has definitely left the house on more than one occasion with the SD card still in my computer. Knowing that the M11's got my back is definitely a thumbs up. So next up then, let's get into kind of the meat of it then. Let's have a look at some of the M10 and M11 images next to each other at the same time. Now, none of this stuff was done on a tripod. I just didn't have the time with the camera to be able to do this. It's all handheld, so some of it might not be super scientific, but I do think it offers a pretty good comparison. And I think we'll kick off with some just standard JPEGs out of both of these two cameras. Now, my personal feel here is the fact that the M11 definitely has a bit of a magenta cooler shift to it than the M10, which I think sways more towards a warm kind of green look. Importing the raw files into Lightroom and exporting them using the M10 and the M11 profile, the results stay about the same. The M11 still has that coolish look and the M10 maybe that little bit warmer. I do think the other really big difference between these images as well is how the camera has exposed on both cases. I had the f-stop the exact same using the same lens, but the M11 is almost always a little bit darker, and I don't think that's a bad thing. We're going to talk about that in a little bit too. Importantly though, all of this kind of color, cast and temperature is really easy to fix with raw files in post. For me, the reality is I'd probably just have to go through each of my presets and tweak a little bit more warmth into each of them, and I would get a very similar look between these two cameras when it comes to colors. But if we are talking just straight out of camera, standard JPEGs, I do think the M10 might win a little bit, but that's because I have a personal preference of warm images. If you personally like cooler images, then you might actually prefer the M11. But one really big thing is the fact that the M10 has next to no JPEG customization inside of it, whereas the M11 comes with far more options. In terms of kind of color settings, inside we've got standard, vivid, natural monochrome and high contrast monochrome. They're all kind of subtle looks. I think my favorites would probably be natural and that high contrast monochrome. And inside of each of these options, you do also have a little bit more flexibility as well. Now, as somebody who is also a Fuji shooter, having these JPEG options in here for me is a big win. I'm really used to, throughout a day in a shoot, especially if I'm on a trip somewhere, just quickly sending a small JPEG through to my phone so that I can post it up on socials and keep people up to date with what I'm doing. So if you're somebody that just shoots RAW, you might not care so much, but for me, there is definitely some benefit I find in having a little bit of JPEG customization in camera. Another trick that this camera has up its sleeve is actually some RAW customization. Now, the sensor inside the camera is a 60 megapixel sensor, but you can actually output RAW files at 60 megapixels, 36 megapixels and 18 megapixels. And Leica isn't cropping into the sensor to achieve this, it's actually using the full frame but using some fun algorithms and some line binning to result in a full frame readout just at smaller megapixels. Now Leica also claim at 36 megapixels and 18 megapixels that you're going to get one more stop of dynamic range over that full 60 megapixel image. Now, I would try to test this, it's not super scientific, but here's an image up on the screen now, purposely chosen where it's got a really bright highlights at the top and pretty dark shadows at the bottom. And here they are at all 3 megapixels, and I personally can't tell the difference in dynamic range. If we boost the exposure 2 stops and then have a look at the shadows, I still can't really tell the difference. And if we drop the exposure 2 stops and look at the highlights, I still can't really tell the difference. So for me personally, I really struggled to kind of realize this one extra stop of dynamic range. And for me, I think I came into this experiment thinking that I would run this camera at 36 megapixels almost permanently, but I think the reality is I've come out of this feeling like I would actually run the camera at 60 megapixels all the time and not worry about the fact that I might be losing one stop of dynamic range. The other thing as well with 60 megapixels is obviously you get to crop, and it also helps with print sizes. Now lots of people are going to be like, no one needs 60 megapixels to print, but I'm sat in a room at the minute that's got 3 A2 prints of my own on the walls, and quite a few of them, especially the deer one that you can probably see like here, is pretty terrible if you look it up close because it was a 20 megapixel image that I cropped and then I blew it up to A2. Now 60 megapixels for me is definitely something I can get value out of because I do print large, and I'm also pretty lazy sometimes when it comes to kind of leveling out horizons, and knowing that when I'm straightening them horizons I'm not losing too much resolution, it's definitely something I can get value out of. The other downside obviously to high megapixels is going to be file size. Now for the images we were just looking at, the 60 megapixel RAW file is 85 meg, the 36 megapixel RAW file is 51 meg, and the 18 megapixel file is 18 meg. Now for me, I personally find the 85 mega file is something that I can live with, but depending on how you store your photos and how good you are at deleting the ones that you don't like and how many you take, your mileage might vary. Now one of the issues that I have with my M10, and I had it with my previous M240, is the fact that the camera just does not care about your highlights in your image. If an image is well exposed but the highlights are blown, the camera will just shoot away. Now something that's changed with the M11 is the fact that regardless of whether you're in rangefinder or using the LCD, the camera meters from the sensor. Now the downside to this is that the shutter needs to open and you see the slightly slower boot up times that we talked about earlier, but the result is the fact that this M11 exposes far better than any of the M's that I've tried before. You can see it in quite a lot of the images, like this one here with the trees, that the highlights just aren't blown out and the shadows still have a pretty good amount of detail in them too. And if you've ever edited RAW files before, you'll know that it's so much easier to raise up the shadows than it is to try and bring down highlights. The amount of images I've got in my M10 where there is some pure white images of the sky is pretty annoying. And this M11 is clearly a lot better just from my few hours of using it. It also has an option in there as well for highlight priority. I tried this out in some pretty crazy situations at times and it definitely works, and it's definitely something that I could see myself using in some pretty tricky lighting situations. So one of the really big wins for me is the fact that this M11 definitely meters scenes better. Two more additions to the M11 over the M10 have got to be the fact that we now have a lower base ISO of 64, and we've also got an electronic shutter for the first time in an M body. These two kind of combine together to offer a solution to shooting wide open in sunny conditions. You now have that lower ISO and you can always lean into an electronic shutter if you need to. I think that goes all the way up to something like 16,000th of a second. One thing that you're definitely going to want to bear in mind though is the fact that the electronic shutter, the readout speed of the sensor isn't all that quick. So if you are using the electronic shutter, you're going to want to make sure you're shooting pretty slow moving subjects, or you are going to experience that kind of rolling shutter effect. Now for me personally, most of the time if I'm shooting wide open, I'm probably shooting people or a portrait, and most of the time they're not moving that quick. So this gets a thumbs up from me because it means I can shoot wide open portraits far easier than I've ever been able to before. But now I think we come on to the big thing that stood out the most for me. And that's the battery life for this new camera, and also that combined with the fact we now have USB-C port on the bottom. I took a trip to London reasonably recently, a few weeks ago, to make my 35mm Summilux video, and I took two Leica M10 batteries with me, and I used them both completely to the point I ended up cutting that video a little bit shorter than I wanted to, and I had a whole nother video lined up for the nighttime and the evening in London that I just couldn't do because both batteries had died. Now when I was first given the M11 and I took it out, I got to where I was going, kind of the South Bank area, and I realized that the camera only had 50% battery, and I assumed that meant that my trip was going to be cut pretty short and I was going to be heading back to the shop and giving them their camera back. However, I took the camera out for I think about 5 hours in total, and I took nearly 300 shots, and I went from 52% down to 23% when I gave the camera back, which is absolutely mind-blowing. I think this might actually be the best battery performance of any camera I've ever used. And the fact that if the battery does run out, you can just use a battery bank and plug it in and charge it back up would have meant that in my previous video a few weeks back, I could have kept shooting, I would have had a better video, and I'd have also had a whole nother video recorded that I just couldn't do with my M10. The battery life is honestly incredible, and it just stands out so much. And the way they've achieved this is through a bigger battery, and I imagine an awful lot of kind of efficiencies when it comes to the processing. So I think then it's about time that we looped back around to the start of this video and answered the two questions I kicked off with. One, am I going to be buying the camera? And two, is it a worthy successor to the M10? Now, when it comes to am I upgrading, what's the cost involved? Now, I think the difference in these two cameras is somewhere between £3,000 and £4,000, depending on whether you go new or used. I'd probably go used, so I think I need to bridge about £3,000 here. Now, short term for me, I'm not going to be upgrading, and it's mainly because of that price difference at the minute, and also the fact that I think I might try and reward myself with this camera. I might try and set a sub goal, and when I get to that sub goal, I'll kind of treat myself to it. So if you're not subscribed, definitely think about doing that now. But long term, I definitely do want to bring this camera to the channel. It's just that the timing isn't quite right for me. And then onto the second question then, is this a worthy successor to the M10? Now, I firmly sit in the camp of yes, it is. I think it's really easy to look at the M11 and just be like, well, it's an M10 with a 60 megapixel sensor inside of it. But I think it's far more than that. We've got better battery life, we've got USB-C charging, we've got a touchscreen that's useful. I personally can make use of 60 megapixels. We've got new storage options with backups and internal memory. We've got auto exposure that's better than ever. We've got a lower base ISO. We've got electronic shutter. There's so much more to this camera than just the fact that it's got a 60 megapixel sensor inside of it. So I'm really excited about getting one of these cameras in the future, even if it isn't right now. And if you've enjoyed this video, guys, please do not forget to like and subscribe. And if you've got any questions about anything you've seen in this video, please feel free to hit me up down in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.